Good afternoon and welcome. May the Lord give you his peace. Amen. Genesis 45, verse 5. So an extremely profound passage in the Bible. This is the conclusion of this story of Joseph. You remember when he was a kid, his older brothers were going to kill him, but then they decided to sell him into slavery. He's down in Egypt and he's able to rise in the ranks. He becomes the number 2 under Pharaoh. And then there's a huge famine in the land and people are dying, so they go down to Egypt to get food. And as number 2 in the government, he is in charge of distributing food. And his brothers come, but they don't recognize him because this is years later. And he pretends like he doesn't know them at first. And then eventually he breaks down and admits, hey, I'm your brother Joseph. And they're like, uh-oh, the one that we sold into slavery like 40 years ago, but then he forgives them. And then he says this really profound line. This is Genesis 45, verse 5. But now do not be distressed and do not reproach yourselves for having sold me here. It was really for the sake of saving lives that God sent me here ahead of you. Oh, that is so profound. This is the passage in the Bible. There are others, but this is the big one that proclaims that God can work good even out of evil. And this is amazing. Yesterday, I kind of talked about this story. For me, is the number one story that helps me to understand Jesus on the cross. You know, that God allows this terrible thing, and out of it, he brings such good. This is why an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, all-good God would allow evil at all. Why would he? It's because in the mystery of his providence, he can bring good out of evil. And I would even propose something, that idea flipped on its side, that he will not allow any evil unless he will bring good out of it. That is how strong our trust and our faith is in this all-good, all-loving, all-powerful God. Just amazing. I was praying over this passage and I did a little research, and sure enough, my great hero, Saint Pope John Paul II, gave a teaching on this moment. It was October 7th, 1989. He was visiting Korea. So he's in Korea and he starts talking to the young, it's a youth mass, to the young Koreans about the suffering that they had gone through a nation. So we know Korea is one of those places, right? The aftermath of World War II, the rise of Russian atheistic communism and the Korean War. Even to this day, their country is split between the North and the South, and they had experienced a lot of suffering. And Pope John Paul delivered a message of great hope based off of this moment in the story of Old Testament Joseph. That all the evil that you've been through, keep praying, keep trusting in God. He will bring good out of the evil. This is what God does. And then a little bit later, it was March of 1999, Pope John Paul was giving teachings on God the Father. And he gave a teaching on this passage on how God's providence is at work. And he shared something that was just so, whenever I read John Paul II's teachings, it just warms my heart so much. I really miss him. He said something that really I thought was so profound. He said that, we look at the topic of God's providence, that is to say, how God works in this world, how he provides for us. We could kind of see it happening in 2 ways, one of which would be all the good things that God does. God is just radiating love and mercy and grace and goodness. Jesus compared it to the sun and the rain. He said, God the Father sends enough sun and rain on everybody. The good, the bad, the ugly, the beautiful. Everybody. Plenty of sun, plenty of rain, which is what we need for life. This is just the nature of God. He just radiates his goodness and his love and his mercy. He provides for everything. And yet we do also have an experience of evil, which we cannot attribute to God. The all-good God does not do evil. He does not actively will evil. That's contrary to his nature. Yet he does allow it, what theologians call his permissive will. But again, it's only because he, in his power, can bring an even greater good out of that. And so even in the evil that happens, we could say that God is also at work in the world. Because he's allowed something, he will bring good out of it. Now, probably all of us will have experiences where something bad happened, and then later on, we see it differently because something good came out of it. We've all had moments like that, right? And then there's going to be moments when something bad happens, and in this life, we just don't see the good. But in the next, we will understand, in the light of heaven, things that don't make sense now, that don't make sense here. Oh, hello, Dee Dee. I didn't know you were going to be here. Things that don't make sense here, they will make sense in heaven. In the fullness of the light of God's plan, God's glory, and it's like just amazing. And so it's this kernel, this truth that really gives us an unshakable faith and hope in God, no matter what we're going through. I think of that wonderful teaching of St. Paul, his letter to the Romans, chapter 8. He says, if God is for us, who can be against us? And then he says, what can separate us from the love of Christ? And then he lists all these terrible things, hatred and war and persecution and suffering and all. And he goes, and even all of that, he uses this language, in the love of Christ, we are conquerors. How great is our faith, that whether we're experiencing goodness and blessing or whether we're experiencing difficulty, we would call it a cross that we have to carry, even really difficult things. The love of God triumphs. He wins. It's this incredibly beautiful. That's why this Jubilee year, we have this theme of being pilgrims of hope in a world that is growing more and more hopeless, that regardless of what we're seeing happening in the world or even in our own lives, we can still have that joy, that peace, that confidence, that trust that God is working all things for the good for those who love him. This is our hope. This is our hope. We'll get glimpses of it here in this life if we're looking for it, but ultimately in the next life, all of it will make sense. All of it will be beautiful. My favorite story to kind of bring this idea home for us is a story that's told about Saint Padre Pio. Evidently, when he was a little boy, he would sit at his grandmother's feet as she was doing needlework in a chair. And from below, looking up at Grandma, he would see the back of the fabric. And of course, if you look at needlework, the back of the fabric is messy. You're like, what are you doing, But if you see the same piece of fabric from above, you see this beautiful image that comes together. And so in this life, sometimes, we're suffering. There's terrible things happening. We look up to God. Why is this happening? It just looks like a jumbled mess. But if we have that faith, that trust and hope in Lord, from the other perspective of heaven, there'll be this beautiful picture, and we'll see how God's providence was at work in everything. Amen.